Awesome. Good morning, guys. Thank you both for joining us for our virtual NErDCamp New Jersey session about using science in nature to get kids interested in books. So I'm going to throw it to you guys to introduce yourself and your books right now.
Hi, my name is Jeanne Zulick Ferruolo, and I write middle grade books about kids finding their own kind of brave. And two books that I've written are Ruby in the Sky, which came out last year, and A Galaxy of Sea Stars, which just came out this year.
Okay, hello, my name is Theanne Griffith. I'm a neuroscientist as well as a children's book author, and my debut chapter book series, The Magnificent Makers, it was just released yesterday. So this is book 1, How to Test a Friendship. Yay!
Congrats.
And this is book 2, Brain Trouble. And these books are a kind of STEM-based chapter book series where the main characters, Violet and Pablo, go on these out of this world adventures to what is called the Maker Maze. So I'll get more into that in a bit.
Awesome.
Excellent.
So we have two different versions of science, but I think that they converge really nicely. So Jeanne, I know you had a great idea to talk to us about using nature as like a writing prompt in the classroom.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I love to write. Nature and science play a big role in all my novels, even though they're fiction novels. And I spend a lot of time writing outside. I go hiking with my dog here, Meadow, who's right here by my side. And I actually do writing out in nature. Nature plays a big role in the settings and in a lot of symbols and metaphors in my stories. So it's really important to me. And so one kind of writing prompt that I've done with other kids is to talk about just writing outside versus inside, and writing about with infusing nature into your stories and your setting. And one of the things that made this kind of a powerful exercise to me is an experience that I had with actually Connecticut DEEP had a program called No Child Left Inside. And at the start of this program, they would ask everybody to just think of a childhood memory. Just quickly think of something quick that you remember from your childhood. And as they went around the room to say quickly, what is that? Almost all of those experiences and memories occurred outside. I think also Theanne will speak a little bit about why that happens because she understands it. Of course, we just appreciate it and enjoy it. So in any event, though, writing in nature can be really powerful in all kinds of stories, whether they are fiction or nonfiction stories. So my exercise kind of was to as a writing prompt, is to have kids write a quick scene, just to make up a scene. I came up with 2 quick prompts where either it could be write a scene where 2 friends meet who haven't seen each other for a long time, which I think works well for everybody these days because we can't see our friends like we'd like to. Or if that doesn't work, maybe just a friend lost something and you come upon them and you're going to help them find them. And I first have them write the scene inside and what happens quickly in that scene. And then write the same scene outside and make sure to write what you smell, what you hear, what you feel, and see how much richer that scene can be portrayed outside, because there's so many more senses that are engaged when you're outside, which again, I think Theanne can explain to us better.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
that was kind of my idea for writing.
Yeah, there's when kind of going back to what you mentioned about memories and being outdoors and all of that, it's really impressive because when we're outside, our nervous system is just really being infused with all of this sensory stimulation. So you're smelling, you're seeing, you're hearing, and it's not that you're not doing that inside, but it just tends to be a little bit more quiet. There's less kind of surprise, I guess, and our brain is really in tune. When we remember something, it's something more novel, right? So when you're outside and there's like, a really cool bird, or, you're just smelling the nature around you, all of those sensations are very tied to memory. And so they can just make for a much more richer experience, and there's literally kind of at the cellular level, if you will, a connection between our physical sensations and memory. Like those brain circuits are very well intertwined. And so it's not surprising that when you infuse nature into writing, it becomes more rich because, you know, our experiences tend to be more rich. For sure, for sure. So I can talk a little bit about one of the writing prompts that I thought of. So as I mentioned, my debut chapter book series, Magnificent Makers, I'm really excited. Sorry, it came out yesterday, May 19th. So I'm so excited still.
That's amazing.
It's my first published work of children's literature. So I'm really happy about that. But in each book, the best friends, Violet and Pablo, go on these kind of science adventures in this magical maker space called the Maker Maze. And they're accompanied by this kooky scientist, Dr. Chris, with her rainbow hair. And in each book, they learn about a different science topic. And in book one, they learn all about ecosystems and the food chain. And so one of the writing prompts that I thought would be really fun for kids to engage in is thinking about their local ecosystem, you know? And I think this is especially appropriate for nowadays when a lot of kids are stuck at home. Maybe they can't even get outside like they normally do based on where they live, if they're in a more urban environment or live in an apartment. But nonetheless, they can kind of tap into their imagination, either go outside or look out their window, and they can do two things. One, they can actually see the world around them and say, you know, what is my local ecosystem? What are the plants that are in my neighborhood? Describe them. Use a lot of detail, you know, throw in as many adjectives as you can. Science writing is very creative, but it's also very precise. So I think this is a great way to get kids to kind of build their vocabulary as they're describing the world around them. So they can describe the animals they see, the different kinds. Are there bugs? Are there birds? Are there a lot of squirrels? What color are they? You know, what texture is their fur? All of that it's a really great way to kind of get kids building their vocabulary and using as much vocabulary as they can to describe the world around them. So that's one way you can do it. And another way that's a lot of fun is to ask kids, okay, so that is our ecosystem, you know, locally. Why don't you make one up? Make up an ecosystem. So what are the different members of an ecosystem? We have producers, which are plants. So, you know, invent a weird plant and tell me all about it. And cool. Or consumers are the animals in the local environment. Make up a new animal or make up a new bug. And this really allows kids to then tie these science concepts into their writing and their creative side. So I think that'd be a really fun way to get kids, again, thinking about the world around them, but then allowing them to escape to another place that they've created all themselves.
Very cool.
I know that I teach high school, so both of you have books that are geared a little younger, but what I love is that I'm sitting here listening to you thinking that could work all the way up through like grad school. You could have people do that. And you know, we're doing remote learning right now, and one of the activities my freshmen are doing is a scavenger hunt where they're using apps like iNaturalist or the Google Photo app to find plants outside their house and try to identify them. You could do it with birds with the Merlin app. So that's so cool. You can infuse that nature writing and then that science communication. So it has all these cross-curricular components too, if teachers wanted to work together to do something like these writing prompts.
Exactly. And that's what I'm really excited about with this series, because a big goal of mine was to really bridge that kind of science literature literacy gap. You know what I mean? Teachers, you guys are angels on earth. And your time is you have to cram so much into so little time. And so finding ways to kind of kill two birds with one stone is just, you know, that's kind of what I was trying to do with these books.
And I love that you mentioned that science writing is so precise, but at the same time, I think we could also have kids look at nature as a metaphor too in the writing that they're doing, right?
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about that because I use nature so much as metaphors in all my writing. even in animals. And actually, I saw another exercise when I was looking at various writing prompts, and it's to go outside and see something in nature that is symbolic of the student, the writer. In Ruby in the Sky, right away, she meets this, she finds this rabbit that's kind of hiding and scared. And she doesn't realize it, but the rabbit that she tries to help is, and feeds and takes care of, is symbolic of herself. And coming out of being very nervous and scared, and then eventually coming out of herself. The moon is a huge symbol of courage in Ruby in the Sky and the various phases of it. And again, in Galaxy of Sea Stars, the Atlantic Ocean represents the unknown and what's scary to the main character, Izzy. And so anybody though, any student on a quick nature hike, or even a walk around their yard, or just in their street, can hope maybe find things that in any kind of animal or nature, in a leaf, in a sapling, in you know, even ants crawling or working hard to bring food home, and can find symbols in nature that represent themselves. So I love that exercise about finding yourself in nature.
Yeah,
yeah,
sure.
I love that.
And to kind of piggyback off of that, you know, I think that also you can use a similar writing prompt to kind of get kids kind of awaken their inner scientists and ask them, you know, it could be outside or wherever, ask them like, what is a question that you have about how the world works? You know, like, what is, you know, why does the moon, you know, have different phases? You know, and kind of get them to write out some of their questions and then think about some of the answers. And the answers don't have to be right? They could make, especially thinking of like younger kids, it could be a lot of fun to say like, well, maybe the moon gets shy and it starts to hide, you know, or something like that. I think there are a lot of ways in which you can kind of start getting kids to think critically, but then also tie it into creativity, right? And again, you know, if you see like an ant trail, where do you think those ants are going? Why do ants do this? You know, and just have them kind of journal, like free journal for 5 minutes about something that they observed outside, or if you're learning about a specific topic in the classroom, have them ask, you know, why do you think this happens this way? And again, the answers don't matter. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. This isn't about, you know, necessarily mastering a scientific concept. It's about getting kids thinking and putting those thoughts into words, you know? And so I think that's another really great way to kind of tie in science, nature, to writing as well.
And yeah, and I'm thinking you could even then have kids do research if they wanted to, and take it in that direction. And then talk about like nonfiction versus fiction and the different types of nonfiction you can have. And then I was, you know, we were talking about how maybe some kids aren't in their normal home, or they don't have access to a backyard right now. You can also even use, there are tons of webcams, right, online that kids can pull up. I know like Cornell has a ton of bird feeder cams, and you could just lose yourself watching and wondering like, what's that bird? And how come those birds are doing that? And where did this one go? So you don't even have, I mean, obviously if you can get outside, it would be great, but you know, it doesn't mean you can't think about nature and science just because, you know, you might be stuck inside as we're quarantined right now.
Exactly. Most definitely. And I think it's really important, you know, to encourage kids to, you know, not every kid has to love nature or has to love science, right? But to encourage the inner questioning, you know, question asking, and I think it's really important to kind of reinforce in kids, you know, that there's nothing that's going to prevent you based on who you are from being able to ask important questions, you know, and that, you know, I guess science belongs to everyone, and the scientific method can be achieved by anyone. And so another writing prompt that I personally am a huge advocate of, and that I think is really important and really fun, is to ask kids to describe what a scientist is. and who is a scientist, you know, because I think there is this unfortunate misconception that I will say is a lot better than when I was a child, but that one, scientists kind of work alone in like a small little room by themselves, and that's not true. Science is very collaborative. But then also that scientists look a specific way. So scientists maybe are old white men because that's what history might tell us, but that's also not true. And that's a big part of why I have the characters of my books coming from really diverse backgrounds, because I wanted to show kids that anyone, no matter what you look like, no matter where you're from, you can be a scientist, you can have fun with science, even if you don't want to study science forever, but it's for you. So a nice writing prompt is to ask kids, describe a scientist, you know, what are some of their features? What does a scientist, you know, need? You know, things like curious, you know, things like that. And then also maybe try and tap into the, you know, what does a scientist look like? And that is where, you know, kids should be able to say they look like me, you know, and they should be able to write all about themselves and say that I look like a scientist. And that, you know, depending on the answers you get from your children or your students, that can then open up a more broad conversation about who can and cannot be a scientist. Spoiler alert, everyone can. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the three of us on the screen, and I think there's science happening in all of our lives, even though we might not all be practicing scientists. You know, you can be a naturalist, you can write about science, you can participate in citizen science, or you can be like a more traditional scientist in a lab, like some kids might think. That there are all these different entrance points, but that I love that idea that questioning is really, you know, the basis. Like, what do I wonder about? That makes me a scientist then.
Exactly. And again, a lot of people think of the sciences of like the hard sciences, you know, chemistry, physics, biology, but social studies, social science is a huge thing. And we need really good social scientists, you know, who are asking really good questions and then answering those questions using data. That's really what science is about, right? It's just answering questions in a methodical manner. And so encouraging kids to begin doing that and using writing to do that is super important, because scientists, like, once you get to a certain level as a scientist, you're writing all the time. That's literally what you're doing 90% of your days. You're not really doing experiments anymore. And so cultivating that in children, you know, around question asking is just, you know, really important, I think just for the betterment of our society. And then also, you know, observing the world around you and appreciating the world around you and being thankful for the beautiful nature that you have, you know, I think, and getting kids to also look kind of outward in that regard, and then tie it to an inner, what is the word? Retro, blanking on the word. Like when you look
finding
inside.
themselves in nature. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, when I listen to you guys, I just think it's so interesting, this wide variety of like science that we're talking about. And we're talking about doing this with young kids, which is amazing. So I think I'd be interested in hearing from both of you, like, what sort of brought you to your connection with science and nature, like when you think back to being a kid.
Sure. I'll talk about that first. Both my parents were teachers. And my father was a science teacher. So we always had a love of it. And okay, I'll just show you a picture actually, because science and nature really inspired Ruby in the Sky. That's my father's hand. He's taking a picture of himself. He taught us to hand feed chickadees. And that's really how Ruby's story begins. And it's really, I hope, for me, it was a magical experience. I hope it gets related in the story, but to be so close to something from nature. And I actually found a journal, which is why journaling and writing as a kid is so important, and in school. This is a story I wrote in middle school. And I just reread it, having forgotten kind of all about it. My mother saves everything. And she found it, and I read it. And there's so many elements of this story that I'd forgotten all about. It's like reading somebody else's story, but there's so many elements of it that I held on to and are a big part of Ruby in the Sky. So just being, I was very lucky to grow up in a very rural area, but growing up in a place where nature was really important to my parents and my family, and we spent a lot of time outside with nature, is just so infused in me that the story I began as a middle grade student found its way to publication in Ruby in the Sky. So I actually recently spoke with a group of retired teachers from Connecticut and thanked them for inspiring that love of writing and a love of nature that started when I was a student in their classes.
That's an awesome story. That's
a
really motivating, like really emotional story. Thank you for sharing. I've always been a science kid. I've just always really enjoyed kind of like the life sciences especially. So when I was younger, for a while, I wanted to be a vet because I loved animals. So I wanted to help animals. And then that kind of morphed into wanting to be a doctor. And then at some point, probably in high school, I think I realized both of my parents were college professors. So I was really familiar with kind of like the academic setting, you know, the collegiate environment. And I realized, you know, academic science and doing science for a career was a possibility, and that research, you know, was fun. I've always liked designing experiments, like asking a question and trying to figure out how to answer it appropriately. And I've always been really driven by figuring it out and getting the right answer, because, you know, science is hard and most of the time it doesn't work. But I've always been really motivated by those opportunities when you ask a question, you design an experiment, and it works. And it's just, you know, there's nothing that for me is, at least thinking about work is more exciting, you know. And so I think I've also always been pretty good at science, if I'm, you know, not trying to sound whatever, but I've always had kind of a knack for it. And I think that also made it more exciting. And, you know, my dad, when I was younger, would always take me to the public library. And there were two books, or series of books, I should say, that I loved the most. One was The Magic School Bus, which has actually been a huge inspiration for my Magnificent Maker series. But I love just, you know, this crazy Miss Frizzle taking these kids on crazy adventures through the human body. And I just thought that was so cool, you know. And then another kind of series of books was by this author, Seymour Simon. I don't know if you guys remember those, but they were these nonfiction kind of, expository nonfiction books, where, you know, it would be about tornadoes or, you know, storms or clouds. And it was just an opportunity for me to just sit there and kind of read about a certain subject. And I just found that so fun. I really loved learning about the world, you know, around me. And then also combining that with kind of doing and making. And so one thing that I wanted to point out about the books, because this was something that my editor and I thought was really important, was to include not just, you know, some facts and stuff, but also at the end of each book, there are actual activities that the kids can do. So there are two kind of do-it-yourself maker activities. And at least one of them is directly tied to an activity or that the kids do in the book. So when reading this, students can kind of feel like they're part of the story, you know, by being able to engage in an activity that Violet and Pablo did themselves. And again, for me, that was important because I always felt science had two sides, and both of them I was always really drawn to, which is the learning and the kind of intellectual side, and then the making and the doing and the experimenting. So those are kind of the two things that have always really attracted me to science, and I wanted to incorporate both into the books.
And you two sort of bring together that intersection of like the humanities and science. You've both found ways to follow your interests or your passions in science, and also sharing and writing about it. In all different formats, whether it's middle grade novels or the Maker series. And then Theanne, do you want to talk about your background? in your Zoom background.
Oh, yes. I was like, my science background?
No, your actual
background. Zoom background. Let me see if I can like slide out here if that works.
Because that's a whole other area of like sort of the arts.
Yeah. So my Zoom background is actually a picture that I took of some neurons. And so these are neurons that are called dorsal root ganglion neurons. And they're the ones they actually are little bundles, and they line our spinal cord. And so I don't know if you can kind of see, but those kind of like little wispy things, those are projections. Those are kind of the beginnings of projections. And these neurons send out these fibers, they're called, out, and they innervate our skin. So our skin is full of little, if you can kind of almost imagine little like neuron feet that are there, and those are what are detecting all of our bodily sensations like temperature, touch, itch even, pain obviously as well. And so when you're like out in nature and you feel the wind blowing over your skin, or you pick up a cool rock and you feel how like smooth it is or how jagged it is, those signals are initially being sent via these neurons that are in my Zoom background. And this image that I took was actually selected to be a cover image for the Journal of Neuroscience. And I don't know if you see up in the corner, I have the Society for Neuroscience logo because it was chosen recently to be one of the Society for Neuroscience Zoom backgrounds. So I took this image about 4 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago. So
that's so cool.
One of the first ones that I took when I was working at Columbia University, and it just came out really nicely, which again is a little bit of luck of the draw because a lot of the images that I took didn't come out as well. But that's another good lesson to be learned in science is resilience and perseverance.
I'm imagining that little chickadee landing on your hand, and then all of that touch transmitting, which is really cool.
Yeah,
even the I always felt the wind from its wings, like when it was so close to you, you could actually feel the wind from the chickadee's wings, like on your skin. So yeah, very cool.
Yeah, so even down to that cellular level, it's so cool. I think a lot of times people and even teachers tend to think that science and writing are really separate, and it's partially because they're in these silos in school, especially once you get to like middle school and high school. But as you were both talking today, like it's clear they're, writing and observing and wondering and performing science are all just so interwoven, and they give you so many different paths that you can take, whether it's focusing on writing or it's doing research in the lab or it's, like I said, doing citizen science. There are so many different ways to be a scientist, which is really cool.
Actually, you just gave me a really fun idea that I thought about for like a writing prompt, which is like, let's say you're learning about something, like even like this Zoom background, right? If you would show this to an appropriately aged child, maybe this is probably a little bit more for high school students, but like, what do you see here? And describe it in as much detail as you can. And then you talk about what it is and what it does, because as scientists, we write so much. Like, I don't know how to drive that point home anymore. You're writing grants, you're writing papers, and you need to be able to communicate these kind of complex ideas to other scientists who may not be experts in your field. So they may not, know all of the jargon. So you need to be able to, what we call actually in science, craft your story and explain to people why you asked this question, why it is important, and then what you found in the right amount of detail using the right words such that it's digestible. So a nice writing prompt could be like, show, students a picture of something that they're going to be learning about and ask them to write what they see and make observations and make guesses as to what purpose this thing or this image serves. That could be a really fun way to kind of introduce a science topic and incorporate some science writing in there.
Yeah. And what I think is so important in both of your books is that you're helping kids connect with the world around them, because you obviously both had really deep connections with science and with nature as children, and that obviously plays a big role in your adult lives. and it's clear that that needs to start when kids are little and continue through high school, or else they're not going to be adults who are, you know, paying attention to what's going on in the natural world around them, or not paying attention to, you know, the importance of those neurons and that sense of touch and the feel of the wind, because the feel of the wind is important both in a very physical sense when we're talking about like hard science, and then also in that metaphorical sense, like, you know, that breeze and what it means for you to just feel that. I think that's so cool how you guys both are able to talk about the same topic, but from these different angles and come to the same conclusions, which is amazing.
Definitely.
So I guess my last question for you both is, what advice do you have for teachers who want to get their kids interested in writing more, especially in our current environment of, you know, lots of screen time and and stuff like that?
I would say that one of the most important things is to figure out what kids are interested in. You know what I mean? And have them really have any writing focus as much as you can on what kids are excited about. You know, if kids don't want to write about, you know, something scientific or nature, that's fine. Have them make up a story about, you know, their friends at the mall or whatever. You know, it doesn't have, I think the most important, and I mean, think about it as yourself. You know, if you had to write about something you don't want to write about, you're going to, like, if I had to write a story about something I wasn't excited about, it's going to be a pretty bad story. So I think just finding what they're interested in and excited about, and trying to craft some writing around that is important. And it doesn't have to be, you know, formal. It doesn't have to, you know, have, you know, your intro, you know, 3 paragraphs and conclusion. It can be bullet points. It could be even drawing with like graphic novel style, with like some blurbs, just getting ideas on paper. I think especially given the current circumstances, is just the most important thing. Having them connect with ideas in their head and getting them on paper, however that takes shape.
Yeah, I really would just echo what Theanne said. I loved what you said about even just drawing, you know, your background. Just what do you think it is? What does it look like? It's having them pay attention to detail. And also, you know, of course, interest. There's so many different ways of writing, and that's why I like also going outside in nature. And like Theanne said, even if you just wanted to draw a picture instead of writing words, that's still writing, that's still paying attention. In all my books, you know, the main characters are interested in science and nature. For Ruby, it's the moon and following that. And in Galaxy, Izzy is fascinated by and inspired by the scientist Marie Tharp, who measured the ocean. And I even talk about this. She decides to measure the lagoon, what she lives on. It's a tidal lagoon on the other side of the Atlantic, separated from the Atlantic Ocean by a barrier beach. And she was measuring it and mapping it. And really, I went out and did this, you know, to make sure it was authentic for the story. And that's writing. I use a lot of maps for myself in my story, but mapping is a way of writing and can turn into something else. So I would really just echo what Theanne said, finding something that you're interested in. And for those kids who don't want to just sit at a desk and the writing doesn't come to them, which we can all relate to, is get out there and realize there's a lot of different ways to do it. It's not just writing a story or writing a paragraph. It can be mapping or charting or drawing pictures too.
Yeah. My husband, the cartographer, would be very happy to hear you say that.
Well, Marie Tharp, and I loved what Theanne said about what does a scientist look like, because in both my stories, I try to explore that a little bit. The character Abigail in Ruby in the Sky is inspired by Margaret Hamilton, who was one of the coders that nobody ever heard about till recently for Apollo 13. And then again, in Galaxy, it's Marie Tharp. And her story is just so fascinating because she mapped the ocean with data provided by the male scientists that were allowed to go on the research vessels. And she was at Columbia. She wasn't even allowed to go out. And there's a New Jersey connection because they moved to New Jersey to do this project from Columbia. but it's fascinating. I wish I had her map here behind me. Incredible. It's just mesmerizing to look at how she persisted and resilient and and broke down barriers to make important scientific discoveries.
That's awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us this morning and for being part of our virtual NERDCamp New Jersey session.
Thank
I'm
you
so
so
grateful.
much for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor.
Thank you. And we'll share your social media handles and everything in case teachers have questions or anything like that. They can reach out to you there.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all both. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Take care.
Take care.